Good evening, everybody. We could. Good to see such a good turnout. Hi, my name is Andrew Smith, and together with Dr. Shawn here and Professor George, we run the Reasons for Faith group out of Windsor Park Baptist, but we are kind of spreading ourselves around as also. Yeah, come in. So good to see you all here. Reasons for Faith is a kind of like a resource group. We're kind of affiliated a little bit with Thinking Matters. You've probably heard of them. And we do seminars around the place. So I think this is the third one we've done this year with Calvary. So that's really good. We have a YouTube channel with about 30 to 40 YouTube videos of previous seminars. So have a look at that at some stage. Now, it's what I want to do today is advertise my new book. I wrote this, just finished this in the last few months and printed it, and there's copies over here on the table. And it's a result of my wee journey into apologetics in 2016 when I went to the UK for 3 months and had a look at particularly areas around apologetics and philosophy in general, how it applies to the church and also to the mission organisation which I belong to, which is sim.org. And so I interviewed 18 people, and amongst them people like John Lennox, Alistair McGrath, Michael Green, N.T. Wright, and a whole list of names there. So I actually sat down with these people and talked to them and recorded the transcripts. I recorded the interviews and then got transcripts. So I had a pile of transcripts like that at the end of it. And I thought, well, what I really need to do with this is kind of sort them out. So I sorted them out into topics that I felt was quite interesting to me, but also to the mission and also to the church and also to people who might be interested in those particular topics. So the ones that I chose were 8 different, and I wrote 8 different essays, one on general apologetics, how it relates to the church, and briefly how it relates to Christian missions and into contextual different ways. And I thought about the church and some of the things that the interviewees were saying about the church today and how apologetics philosophy can fit into that. Parenting, I did one on the origins debate because the origins debate is still alive and well and disputed amongst different churches and different organisations. I thought I'd kind of figure that out a little bit in my own mind and write about it. And I even quote our precious Dr. Shawn here. So he contributed to that. And also I looked at the idea of metaphor and how that works within our looking at reality and how it kind of describes reality and how Revelation uses a lot of metaphor in describing what it's trying to say and what John is envisioning, yeah, that's the word, and how that relates to what he was trying to portray. And then a couple of others, Gospel of Love, what is, the epistemology of love, how do we know what we know, and the best way of knowing is by loving, that sort of thing, and then faith and miracles. And then a few extra thoughts to beef up the price a little bit. So anyway, so the books are over there, and they're $10 each. And if I'm not here, because I'm not feeling so well, my wife who's knitting over there, she will be running that little store. So have a look at those books. That'll be great. Anyway, that's enough of that. Oh, yeah. So there are some details of mine. It's an easy read, so it's a good summer read. You're on the beach, just read a chapter, an afternoon, and it'll put you to sleep on the beach. So that'll be good. Okay, Shawn, you're welcome to come up now and
Okay, sweet.
do your thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and good luck with your book sales, despite the fact I'm quoted in it. Thanks, everyone, for showing up tonight. It's quite a pleasure to see everyone. I'll be talking about science and the supernatural. Yay, these are natural companions. This will be easy. So maybe a little bit about me, for those of you that don't know me. I'm a research fellow at Auckland Bioengineering. My background is applied mathematics. Some of you may notice that I do not have a Kiwi accent. Did anyone notice that? I am from dry and brown New Mexico. Does anyone know where New Mexico is? Hooray! There's more people in this room that know where New Mexico is than I think New York City. Right? It's not a well-known place, but that's where I did my bachelor's in applied maths and my master's. And I also worked at San Diego National Labs, which is one of the huge DOE facilities there in Albuquerque. I was part of a nascent computational biology group. And then I came to do my PhD, a study with a big shot in my field in mathematical biology at University of Auckland, did my PhD, and they didn't kick me out of the country, so I stuck around. I did a few postdocs like at Massey and so forth, and now I'm back at Auckland Bioengineering, and I've done a variety of mathematical biology projects. And if you're curious about what is mathematical biology, well, come talk to me later. I'll talk your ears off. I know a lot about that stuff. But it just so happens that despite my background of mathematics, all my degrees are maths, but functionally I'm a scientist, which makes me feel a little dirty or something. Like, no, I'm really a mathematician. No, I'm a scientist. And you notice things when you're a scientist. Like, has anyone noticed if you go into a lift, how many lifts are missing a certain thing? Right? How many times have you noticed that there's no number 13 in there? Why is that? Why is there no number 13? Did you actually know that 10% of the population suffers from, paraskephophobia? Yes, that's exactly how it's pronounced, right? A fear of Friday the 13th. And actually 85% of elevator panels don't even have the number 13 on them, right? They just don't exist. And there's entire commercial and residential buildings where the tenants, they just refuse to occupy, so they pretend it doesn't exist, right? Right, so you go from 12 to 14, so does that mean the people on the 14th floor? You're on the 13th floor. Hi, guys. They just don't know it. The numbers don't say it, right? So you might be safe. We're curious beings, aren't we? Professional athletes, high caliber athletes, they often perform certain rituals before they compete. Nadal here, the tennis player, he goes through very specific arrangements of bottles before he plays. Usain Bolt, he always points to the sky before he runs. And Michael Jordan, and I didn't know this till I researched this, but he wore his Tar Heels university garb underneath his Chicago Bulls uniform for every single NBA game. He's wearing those, and I hope he washed them. Right? So we have some strange habits and unusual things that we might find familiar. Have you ever had a sense of something that might freak you out a little bit? Hang on, something went wacko. Am I on NDI audio or Cam Link audio? Uh-oh. Okay, we tried that one. Let's see, this might get really loud, so hold on. There we go.
Wait a minute, Dracula. Did you ever have the feeling you're being watched? That the eyes of strange, eerie things are upon you? Look, out there in the audience. People!
Hey, have you ever had that feeling that you're being watched? Have you ever had that sense and you turn around and yes, there's someone staring at you? Most people claim to have turned around to find that someone was staring at them, or to have stared from someone from behind, who then turned around and looked right back at them. A scientific name for this phenomenon is scopaesthesia, from the Greek words for looking and knowing. And this is from a fellow named Rupert Sheldrake. He cooked up this theory to explain it. But he noticed this decades ago, and he published his ideas about that sense of being stared at. How odd. How do you think science responded to his theories, to his observations many moons ago? He was excommunicated. He was made a pariah in the scientific community for his ideas on how the sense of staring works, like what's the mechanism. And he proposed these things called morphic fields, which were a bit beyond the normal material world. A big shot, the Nature editor, Maddox, wrote an op-ed in 1981 that said his book is the best candidate for burning there has been for many years. He didn't like it, right? Get that impression, right? Sheldrake's view can be condemned in exactly the same language that the Pope used to condemn Galileo, and for the same reasons. Heresy. Heresy? In science? Can you have heresy in science? Like, does that sound kind of weird? Sheldrake was a well-respected up-and-coming plant physiologist. The furor that grew out of the assaults in nature put an end to his academic career. His career was destroyed, basically, at least in a mainstream sense. He was excommunicated. Man, I hope that's not someone's indigestion. Huh. Well, anyways. Well, what did Sheldrake do? Did he just cook this up in a vacuum? Did he just like, I think there's this thing and it's really neat. Morphic fields are cool. No, he actually had data. He actually performed experiments. And he showed that there is an effect where here, 60% of the guesses were correct. Someone's staring at you. In a random sequence of trials, the looker either looked at the back of the subject or looked away and thought of something else. Such experiments showed a significant excess of correct or incorrect guesses. They guessed correctly about 60% of the time. That doesn't sound too impressive, but if there's no phenomenon, you should expect 50%. It should be no different than just flipping coins. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It should be 50%. 60% says something's happening. Something's going on. And it wasn't only Sheldrake seeing this data. Years later, other researchers, they started to look at some of these things because many of us experience it. And some scientists go, let's test this, right? They had starers gazing over closed-circuit videos, excluding any sensory cues. They also had subjects not respond saying, I sense something. They actually put detectors on them to detect changes in skin conductance, rather like a lie detector test or something, right? 15 experiments showed a real effect. Studies suggest that an unconscious sense of being stared at is a genuine, independently repeatable effect, providing proof of principle for the effects reported by Sheldrake. Interesting. But they note the difficulties with the evidence. What do you do with this? Excuse me. There's no specific theoretical conception we know of that can incorporate this phenomenon into the current body of scientific knowledge. The theoretical research allowing for and describing plausible mechanisms is necessary. As a scientist, when you look at stuff and you see some phenomenon, the first question you almost always ask, what's the mechanism? How does it work? Right, you pop the bonnet. How does the engine work? So if you're just driving a car and you pop the bonnet and there's nothing there, it's disturbing, right? But it's very unlikely. There's probably something in there, maybe a big rubber band, maybe there's some very bloody feet. Right? There's a mechanism. Something's driving the car. So that's what's happening here. That's what they're saying, right? What's the mechanism? On another note, what did people do before cell phones when you had to get a hold of someone? Hey! Especially if they were supposed to give you a ride home. Hey, you forgot me! Right? So I think we'll have Bart demonstrate this. Does anyone know Bart Simpson? Okay, so he's going to demonstrate this scientific principle of communication pre-cell phone days.
Homer Simpson, pick up Bart. Pick up Bart! Trap-puke-zip! Trap-puke-zip!
What have we told you about writing on the walls? Go to your room!
Pick up Bart. See, it's just this, right? This is what people did before the advent of cell phones. Meet me at the cafe at 10 o'clock or something. What am I talking about? Telepathy. The supposed communication of thoughts or ideas by means other than the known senses. Is this a real thing? Has anyone looked at this? Yeah, there's some researchers looking at this. In fact, there was a large research group studying this stuff for like 30 years. These fellows, Storm and Trisoldi, they did a meta-analysis. They looked at many different studies, testing whether people can transmit the idea of, say, a shape, triangle, square, circle, to someone in another room, that there's no contact between them otherwise. They showed a statistically significant effect for telepathic communications, depending on how they were doing these studies. One of them was to reduce the amount of noise, a Gansfield technique for enhancing psi, a non-Gansfield noise reduction, but with free response, no noise reduction, there was no statistically different effect. So for these techniques that reduce noise, they saw something happen. But what is this stuff? What is this noise reduction stuff? Looks kind of silly. So they gave students at universities pizza to put ping pong balls on their faces and sit under a red light. And they did it. But the idea is to reduce the noise, right? There's something about the signal to noise ratio. Has anyone heard that phrase? Have you ever tried to tune a radio and get onto the station? What's outside the station? That's what you hear. Well, at least that's what I hear on my radio. Right? So you need to tune the thing. You need to get the signal stronger than the noise. But here, just to make it clear, we can have Homer demonstrate this for us to make it very clear, okay? The scientist Homer. Here we go.
I keep thinking I'm forgetting something. Can't think with all this noise.
So he's confusing the signal and the noise, right? So this whole idea is, with these noise reduction efforts to detect telepathy, is to put him into some state, which seems silly. But the idea is so that you're not distracted with stuff going on around you, that you may be more receptive to picking up some sort of signal. But interestingly, they also found that selected participants, believers in the paranormal and meditators, had a performance advantage over just random people. But only if they were in this Gansfield condition, if they had successfully removed enough noise so they could pick up on a signal. Contrast that with skeptics. If you bring in someone that just dismisses it out of hand, there's nothing that can possibly happen. So they'll just say something random. So they'll just randomize the trial. They won't respond to what they think is going on, or they won't be open to the possibility, right? Much like Homer here disregarding the attempts for everyone to tell him, pick up art! Trab puke sib, right? Storm and Trisoldi interestingly noted resistance to this data. We emphasize how important it is to free up this line of investigation from unwarranted skepticism and hasty judgments, so that these communication anomalies might be treated and investigated in a manner with other psychological functions. They're basically saying people are just dismissing it out of hand, but here is evidence. Here's empirical data saying something is happening. Not sure what or how, what's the mechanism? It really is like saying, wow, this car is moving, and you pop the bonnet and there's nothing in there. What's going on? It's a mystery. Way back before Sheldrake had his ideas on morphic fields in the 70s, some researchers, they decided the only way this could happen is through electromagnetic emissions out of your head, or radio waves out of your noggin. So they stuck people's heads in detectors. How much radio waves can come out of a person's head? Right? Just to see, can you actually transmit stuff? They could not detect any EM or electromagnetic fields that could possibly account for ESP, or extrasensory transmissions of any kind. One of our aims was to search for unusual electromagnetic radiation emitted by subjects. If no EM signal were found, this would question the reality of the phenomena. They're presuming that's the only possible way is for radio waves. The consistent absence of any unusual EM radiations associated with the phenomena causes us to question this paranormal nature. How could it even be happening? Because we contend that's the only way, only radio waves. That's the only known force that could have been involved, which is interesting. They're presuming something. They're saying that's the only thing, the only known thing. And they pick EM or electromagnetism or radio waves that we didn't even know existed until the 19th century. So how many of you can detect how good the Wi-Fi is without a device? Oh, no, this way. How do you know? You have a device, right? No one even knew radio waves existed until James Clerk Maxwell. And for those of you that have seen my math talk, this is all the math you get. Sorry. Right? But he predicted, by formulating this relationship between electricity and magnetism, connecting visible light with the invisible, and predicting the existence of radio waves that we exploit all over the place in society today. But it's something we cannot see, nor hear, nor smell, nor feel. And it's so fundamental to life today. Maybe there's another mechanism. Maybe there's another way for these transmissions to occur. We see the car moving, but when we pop the bonnet, we're not sure what's going on in there. This is part of the problem. Nobody has any idea how the phenomenon of telepathy or sense of staring, what's going on here? How do you figure out what's happening? And so that's inspired many other different studies on looking at some paranormal thing or supernatural thing, one of which was on prayer. Does anyone in this room pray? Gosh, I hope so. Right? We are in a church. This is the time and the place. Oh, okay. Settle down. But so this fellow did a review on all the studies that were looking at intercessory prayer. There's been a considerable interest in recent years in measuring efficacy of intercessory prayer for alleviation of ill health in a scientifically rigorous fashion. Some meta-analyses, so they looked at a bunch of different studies, of numerous published studies, and this commentary they made on the usefulness of how these results are presented. Interestingly said, they didn't find evidence in favor or against, so it was basically neutral. They couldn't really find convincing evidence, yes, prayer heals people. No. They couldn't really find evidence, prayer does not heal people, you're wasting your time. They're inconclusive, right? And they actually complained, I think it'd be better off if we did other things. We're not convinced that further trials of this intervention should be undertaken, and we'd prefer to see resources available for such trials used for other things, for health. Interesting. Part of the reason why they were looking for proof of something. There's plenty of proof that prayer is good for things. It focuses people when you pray regularly for things, for yourself or for others. Religious faith itself increases self-control, reducing unhealthy behavior. Also, among cancer patients, those who focus their prayers and thankfulness and concern for others, it reduced the severity of the symptoms. Actually, it's shown that praying for others reduces depression. If you're not focused on yourself, you're focused on others. That in itself says prayer is good. You should be doing it, right? Regardless whether or not you're a Christian and you're a church and you should pray anyways, right? The question of whether this may contribute towards proving or disproving the existence of God is a philosophical question lying outside the scope of this review, right? They bumped into some philosophical things. Does God exist? Does God answer prayer? Oh, I think God answers prayer. I've seen him answer prayer, right? But not really in a scientifically rigorous fashion. Imagine if you will, what if scientists found proof? Yes, prayer heals. Everyone should pray. Throw away your MRIs and your surgical theaters and get rid of those surgeons. Just pray. Who needs a hospital when you could just go to church and have people pray for you and be instantly healed? How do you think people would respond? You'd see an industry of prayer, right? So you could just hire people. I'll just give money to some really spiritual people, and they pray, and then everyone will get healed, right? And then you don't have to deal with all the difficulties of prayer. It's really hard on your knees, etc. Just pay someone else to do it. And this has happened in the past. So this fellow, Terry Jones, had did this hilarious documentary on medieval lives, and he recalled how monks, they turned prayer into an industry. They were profiting by it. So wealthy people that were too busy doing wealthy people things, they gave them money so they could be prayed for their indulgences. I'll hazard a guess that we'd see the same thing today. Not only that, because God doesn't really play along with science, does he? In my experience as a Christian, God's not interested in proving himself to some scientific experiment. I'm sure he was fretting, oh no, they're going to disprove me again. What do I do? Well, God's also not a vending machine. You just push the right buttons and bang, you get what you want. Has anyone noticed that's how God is? He's just a vending machine, right? You just push the right buttons and you get exactly what you want? No. But this also highlights a quandary with what we're looking at here. If indeed there are supernatural beings like God or other supernatural beings, how do you study them under controlled conditions? Maybe this will illustrate one possibility.
And the scientist begins his incantation. Make sure you note it down. There's our spirit. He appears to be in some distress. Perhaps he's missing colleagues or loved ones back at home. He may even be missing you. Do you know this man? Now let's see exactly what a ghost can do under controlled conditions. Can a spirit pass through a solid surface?
Science.
Evidently, yes.
Science. Notice how the scientists, they picked a suitable number for their scientific door. I just had to point that out. Right? This rather highlights the problem. How do you study something that we know so little about? The supernatural. But also supernatural subjects. Almost by definition, God is supernatural. Right? Something quite beyond the world of the natural, what we understand. And when you have a being that has volition, that makes choices, they also can tend to act in unpredictable ways. When workers of the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric in the 1920s were studied for impact on their productivity by varying lighting, temperature, and such in their environment, researchers discovered it didn't matter what they did. No matter what factors they manipulated, productivity went up. Even when work conditions were made worse than they were originally, the personnel worked harder and more efficiently. This has come to be known as the Hawthorne effect. When subjects respond to the fact they're being studied, if you're being examined or experimented on in some way, and you're aware of it, you tend to change your behavior. And it turned out that what was going on, as the investigators concluded, the intention shown to the workers was the cause of what was going on. Well, just think about it. You have these guys come in and you're working hard at this factory and you're like, we're just going to study how productive you are. We'll be taking notes over here. Would you think your job's on the line? It's like, maybe I just have to do really well no matter what they do. Okay, we're going to set the place on fire. You just keep working. Okay, I'll keep working. Right? The Hawthorne effect. Notably, the subject of intercessory prayer studies, God is not without volition, or more precisely, not a simple input-output function, like a laboratory rat, right? Or not a vending machine. Presumably, this extends to other supernatural creatures. The director of the movie The Exorcist filmed an actual exorcism.
This is not fiction.
It's different from all the movies. And I was there to film it.
Friedkin, who was notorious for the Exorcist movie, thought, I'm going to go film a real exorcism. These are real things. These happen. How real they are is another question. Nevertheless, he filmed this event of Father Amort, a Catholic fellow, that was his profession for decades, performing exorcisms. He took this video and he showed it to scientists, to a group of leading psychiatrists in America, all in residence at Columbia University, and their responses were very interesting. Dr. Lieberman, MD, director of the New York Psychiatric Institute, had this to say: I've never believed in ghosts or that stuff, but I've had a couple of cases, one in particular that really just gave me pause. There was a young girl in her 20s from a Catholic family in Brooklyn, and she was referred to me with schizophrenia. And she definitely had bizarre and psychotic-like behavior, disorganized thinking, disturbed attention, hallucinations, but it wasn't classic schizophrenia phenomenology. She responded to nothing. Usually you get some response. There was no response. We started to do family therapy. All of a sudden, strange things started happening. Accidents, hearing things. I wasn't thinking anything of it, but this unfolded over months. One night I went to see her and then conferred with a colleague, and afterwards I went home, and there was a kind of blue light in the house. And all of a sudden I had this piercing pain in my head, and I called my colleague, and she had the same experience. This was weird. The girl's family was prone to superstition, and they may have mentioned a demon possession or something like that, but obviously I didn't believe it. But what this happened is it just completely freaked me out. It wasn't a psychiatric disorder. You want to call it a spiritual possession, but somehow, like in The Exorcist, we were the enemy. This was basically a battle between the doctors and whatever it was that afflicted the individual. Friedkin further showed this to neurophysiologists. One, Dr. Itzhak Fried, clinical specialist in epilepsy, surgery, and seizure disorder at UCLA and in Tel Aviv. It looks like something authentic. She is like a caged animal. I don't think there's a loss of consciousness or contact. She's in contact with the people around her. She responds to the people who talk to her. It's a striking change in behavior. And of course, he's a neurophysiologist, and he says, I believe everything originates in the brain.
Now you know how to treat it? No. So something is happening to her, it's clear. But maybe she puts into it the religious context in which she grew up. Because they believe, obviously, they know what's wrong with her. She's possessed by the devil.
So he speculates that her culture, her belief system, is projected onto her experiences. And that's why they derive it that way. That's why she assumes that that's what's going on. Well, of course, from a scientific perspective, there's a lot of work looking into the brain and beliefs. Some research relatively recent in 2020, they stuck people into MRI machines and had them read religious texts. You see what happens. They had people who were considered religious and people who were considered non-religious. And they looked at the differences in their brains. Religious subjects activated spatially distinct regions of the brain, suggesting that religious experience may be a cognitive process. Something in your brain is doing this. This religious experience was not an emotional experience, nor arousal comparable to that of the happy state, which we observed in the non-religious subjects. The structures of the brain are shown to relate to certain religious functions. And so that makes one wonder, could you stimulate bits of the brain and get a religious response? Someone did this. Excuse me. Michael Persinger created this thing called a God helmet. What it does is it creates magnetic fields and it transcranially stimulates your brain. So it zaps your brain in specific regions using electromagnetism, that thing that we didn't know existed, right? But by targeting the temporal lobes, a specific region of your brain, Persinger found that the resulting seizures could produce spiritual experience in people of no religious beliefs. And he published several works just showing this over the years, that he can actually induce some sort of religious reaction by giving you seizures in the right way and in the right place. The brain. Everyone has a brain. This is your brain, our brain, a brain, right? The different regions of the brain are said to correspond to rationalizing God's intent, supernatural interpretations of experiences, spiritual transcendence. And here, the temporopolar region let's see, what is it? Retrieving religious beliefs stored in semantic and episodic memory. This temporal region is of particular interest. Research has focused on this particular region in the brain and found connections between religious experiences and this particular lobe of the brain, the temporal region. And in fact, seizures in the temporal lobe are strongly correlated with some sort of religious experience. In fact, sudden conversions have followed temporal lobe seizures in people of no prior religious interest. And these researchers pointed out how revisitation of historical accounts rather gave some support to this whole idea that temporal lobe seizures may have something to do with this, such as St. Paul's Damascus Road conversion. They said maybe he just had a seizure. They noted other historical incidents or support for this. Ancient Greek and Hebrew physicians described epilepsy as some sort of sacred disease leading to religious expressions. In the 19th century, delusional religiosity is a common feature in the epileptic insane. But also, these people with epilepsy were often confined along with the insane, regardless of whether or not they were insane. How pleasant that must have been. But Paul, in his conversion, well, it's not too surprising to hear claims that this conversion event may have just been a seizure. This is a manifestation of some neurological malfunction, much like this statement here by a psychiatrist. If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenic. You are schizophrenic. There's something wrong with you. You're broken. You're damaged. Which on its surface appears reasonable. But when you consider more evidence, more data points, particularly regarding Paul, he wasn't alone in the experience. We all fell to the ground. Did they all have simultaneous seizures? The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but didn't see anyone. Did they all hallucinate together? My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice. They had rather different hallucinations. Or maybe he just had an encounter with a supernatural being. There is a tendency amongst researchers, not all to be sure, to assign experiences of some transcendental nature as rooted in some psychiatric or neurophysiological malfunction, as the psychiatrist suggests here. In fact, the phenomenon of hearing voices itself is actually far more widespread than some therapists realized, such as, remember Dr. Lieberman hearing things in his house with a blue light and a piercing sensation? In 1988, a remarkable experiment was performed. There was a patient of a counselor who experienced what they called auditory verbal hallucinations. They heard voices. The therapist sought some way to deflect this patient's isolation and their suicidal thoughts. And they performed an experiment, a remarkable experiment, on TV. I began to wonder if she could communicate with others who also heard voices. This might have a positive effect on her condition. And this therapist cooked up this idea to have his patient share her hearing of voices on television and to see what happens, how people respond. On an evening television talk show, a patient talked about her voices. 450 people who also were hearing voices reacted to the program by telephone. We sent them questionnaires. In order to get more information, how did you cope with this stuff? A meeting for people hearing voices was organized. Many had very different ways of understanding these experiences and appeared to be competent, not disabled, and not in any way ill, not schizophrenic. Interestingly, some of the voices may have sounded like someone they knew, family, friends, neighbors, or perhaps a celebrity. Some of the hearers would actually go to these people and test whether the voice was actually the person they recognized them to be. Every time I thought I had telepathic contact with people, I went to visit them. If those people denied having telepathic contact with me, then I argued with the voices, and we scolded each other. And this only made the voices stronger and more aggressive. Other coping mechanisms. They varied. Let's see, 33% of respondents were able to ignore the voices successfully, but that often came at a cost. I was determined to win, and I continued to ignore everything. I did so by keeping myself busy. I solved a lot of crossword puzzles. My house had never been cleaner. The result was that life became more peaceful, but in a constrained way, I almost couldn't relax. Couldn't relax. That's me. This is future Dr. Shawn, sporting very fashionable shoes. Do you like my Chuck Taylors? In 1990, I went into drug rehab. I am a recovering drug addict. I went into a hardcore program where they shaved your head. That's why I have such a lovely hairstyle. Right, see how fashionable I am? Hair, shoes. I got the whole bit. I worked at a hotel in Colorado that we were contracted to clean. It was nestled in the Rocky Mountains under the shadow of Long's Peak, a beautiful place. I was very fortunate to be there. An elderly man used to come hobbling up the hill and do Bible studies with us. And he noticed that many of us did not have Bibles, so he gave me this one. On the 29th day of January, 1990, Galen Perrick gave me this Bible. Of course, I didn't really think too much about it, how cute he's trying to convert me. But I did keep the Bible because I didn't know that much about it. I was not raised Christian. I was raised in a Japanese sect of Buddhism. So, of course, I heard some of the stories about David and Goliath, Noah and some ark, and a bunch of animals, mosquitoes, male or female, right? So I heard about that stuff. But I was raised Buddhist. So I kept this Bible as a reference. It's like, oh, this is useful. I can refer to it, so I can know maybe a little bit more about this Christianity stuff, which is kind of weird to me. Until about 1994, I didn't bother reading this thing. But I started having encounters with very unusual things. I started hearing voices, auditory, verbal manifestations. Thank you very much. But these included visuals. I was seeing things, seeing critters and creatures that were quite disturbing. I was having physical sensations that had no direct physical cause. Also, some of the voices that I heard came out of my stomach. And at first I thought, oh, this is just an undigested ham sandwich, right? But then there were actual vocalizations, words that were being said. I used some similar techniques to these testimonials, right? I found myself shunning isolation. If I wasn't alone, it didn't seem to happen so much. So I suddenly became very social. Let's go hang out with people. Let's get out of the house. Some of the voices also sounded exactly like people I knew, right? I didn't go confront them. Actually, I didn't tell anyone this stuff for years because why? Well, I thought I'd be institutionalized, right? You have schizophrenia. Here's some drugs. Yeah, not what I needed. Partly inspired by this events, in 1990, the Bible that was given to me in 1990, I read in 1994. And I happened to read Matthew 12, 31. Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit's an eternal sin. It can never be forgiven. Any other sin can be forgiven, but not this one. And after reading more about what does this mean? Wow, I'm reading this Bible thing. The crucifixion is an offer of a relationship. I thought that's really cool. Because to me, my philosophy of life, the universe, and everything is relationships are the most important things we have. And so a natural response was to say, Jesus, I love you. And at that moment, something happened that I'll never forget. I heard a bell ring, ding, and I heard a voice declare, I give you your life back. Which didn't mean anything to me at the time. I was just like, this is just more goofy spiritual voices talking. I'll just put it on the shelf. Weird. I just knew, I love Jesus. This is cool. What do I do now? We go to church. Okay, go to church. And reading my Bible, devouring my Bible, I read something extraordinary. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. If you give it up your life for me, you will find it. I give you your life back. I saw something consistent between my personal experiences and the biblical worldview. I didn't share this with people for many years. I thought this is too weird, right? But you know what? The Bible's full of weird things. I did share it with some of my scientific colleagues, maybe bits and pieces, and you know how they would react? You must have had drug-induced schizophrenia, right? You must have just been delusional. You were hallucinating. Something's wrong with you. You should get checked. We've been wondering for years, Shawn. Right? Well, that's partly why I've looked into this stuff over the years, right? And I'm particularly pleased to say that I'm by no means the only person to not be unhealthy and experience auditory verbal manifestations, right? Other people experience this stuff. It's not just me. Healthy individuals with auditory verbal manifestations, who are they? How could this be? They noted a high correlation between those that experience hearing voices and childhood abuse and trauma, subclinical schizotypal, a higher functioning schizophrenia, family loading for psychosis. And particularly interesting in their results was simply receptivity to the experience. Remember that thing about receptivity to telepathy, sense of staring, etc.? In fact, they had this to say about what they were observing. Participants experiencing hearing these voices for a mean period of 29 years, fulfilling the criterion persistent hallucinations, which in itself is sufficient for a classification of psychosis. You're broken. Something's wrong with you. But the fact that these hallucinating subjects were functioning normally and not in need of treatment indicates that the diagnosis, psychosis, is clinically wrong. You have one data point. You're hearing voices. You're broken. Something's wrong with you. You're hearing from God. You're schizophrenic. You need drugs. You need treatment. Something's wrong with you. That's not how science works. You need multiple data points before you can fit and see what's going on. I've experienced multiple episodes of auditory verbal manifestations, and looking back over decades, 40-some years. Some of my childhood experiences, oh, that's what was happening. Varying degrees of intensity and frequency, varying modes, either detached, disembodied, or from my undigested ham sandwich, right? They're still ongoing today. It hasn't stopped. And in fact, after I became a Christian, it got intense, far more intense, and angry. And I'm still a Christian, partly because of this. A consistency between my personal experiences and the biblical worldview. I give you your life back. They suggested that someone like me that experiences these things is not, by definition, psychotic. So you can relax. Okay. I'm still goofy, though. Right? But thinking of consistency between my personal experiences and the Bible, there's a particular episode in the Bible that comes to mind that I remember reading this the first time going, this is astonishing. In the book of Acts, one day as we were going down to the place of prayer, we met a demon-possessed slave girl. She was a fortune teller who earned a lot of money for her masters. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, and they have come to tell you how to be saved." This went on day after day until Paul got so exasperated he turned and said to the demon, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ, come out of her." And it did. And the masters lost their golden goose. They made a lot of money off that girl. Interestingly, the word here for demon-possessed is very specifically interesting to me. Python. In Greek mythology, the name of the Pythian serpent or dragon that dwelt in the region of Pytho at the foot of Parnassus and Phocis and was said to have guarded the oracle of Delphi. It's also been translated as ventriloquist. Ventriloquist, ventriloqui, which means to speak from the stomach, ventriloqui. We know the term ventriloquist for, oh, those guys that operate dummies, and it's creepy, right? But this had a very specific meaning in the ancient world. Originally, ventriloquism was a religious practice. The name comes from to speak from the stomach. The noises produced by the stomach were thought to be the voices of the unliving. Ventriloquists would interpret the sounds and, as well, foretell the future. One of the earliest recorded groups of prophets to utilize this technique was the Pythia, the priestess of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, who acted as the conduit for the Delphic oracle. My personal experiences with voices in the stomach resonates with this. And the first time I read this, I was freaked out. It's like, really? Here's another instance of my personal experiences that are in the Bible. I've never succeeded at recording them. You know, I'm a scientist. Let's get more data. And so, I've tried. You know, I set up recording devices at night because that's usually when it would happen. I've actually woken up in the middle of the night and the voices are very clear and distinct. And one time it was astonishment, like, oh, he's awake. Pretend nothing happened. So I tried to record this thing. And after years and years of trying, you know what I recorded? That's pretty much what I got. Right? I suspect that the Hawthorne effect is in play. The subjects are aware they're under study and are changing their behavior. Numerous dimensions of my personal experiences I don't have time to go into. But of course, there's these auditory verbal manifestations, physical restrictions, pain, sensations, not related to any physical cause. That sometimes it's a complication because sometimes I have a physiological thing I need to deal with. I'm like, is it supernatural or not? Like when I was a drummer in a punk band. One time I felt something very sharp going into my shoulder and I couldn't move my arm. But I was playing a show, so I just punch it, force it through, and you play punk music. You know what happened? The next day I had these massive bruises all over my shoulder. And there was nothing connecting what happened with the physical cause. Many other instances that I could go through. Other things that I experienced, visual manifestations of fantastic and terrifying beings, and also a vision of an otherworldly place that I do not want to go back to. My glimpse of an otherworldly place was quite different from someone else's. In the fall of 2008, after 7 days in a coma, during which the human part of my brain, the neocortex, was inactivated, I experienced something so profound that it gave me a scientific reason to believe in consciousness after death. This is from Dr. Eben Alexander, author of this book, Proof of Heaven. Had a near-death experience that had this clearly profound effect on him, but it also occurred under clinical observation. They were monitoring him in a hospital. His entire cortex shut down. Apparently he had some rare bacterial meningitis, and as far as he knew, no one had ever traveled to this dimension he experienced while their cortex was completely turned off and under detailed medical observation for 7 days. As he said, his brain was shut down. The cortex, this includes pretty much all the lobes of the brain that manage intelligence, personality, motor function, planning, organization, touch sensation, processing touch, processing language. And that includes this temporal lobe. Remember the observations about epilepsy and the temporal lobe and some spiritual experience? None of this was working, and he's got the medical receipts to prove it. A near-death experience. These are noted with interesting features that are independent of expected and numerous influences. Some researchers noted that these are independent of cultural backgrounds, geography, religiosity. Unlike that neurophysiologist, well, they're Catholic, they must think it's some spiritual possession. These near-death experiences are independent of that, independent of gender differences, education, marital status, employment, independent duration and cause, whether you had a traumatic or not a traumatic brain injury. And they all describe very similar environments and experiences. That's wild. And here this man, his brain was turned off, and he has the receipts to prove it. And he experienced all this. The researchers had this to say: anecdotal reports of accurate external world descriptions occurred during clinical death with a flatline EEG. They were brain dead. Some authors have questioned the causative relationship between cortical activity, whether or not your brain is actually doing stuff, and consciousness itself, speculating whether consciousness might be a disembodied entity rather than a physical product of the brain. That's an extraordinary statement. Mind and brain are different things. That the mind can function without a functioning brain. You don't need this thing to work to experience a near-death experience. I don't recommend trying it, right? But it says a lot. It says a lot that brain structures are not the source of consciousness. This is strongly contrary to the reductionist materialist view that says it's all in the brain. No brain, no mind, no consciousness. It's merely a vehicle for consciousness. It provides mechanisms of interaction with the material world that damage can distort, inhibit, or maybe expand perceptions. Not consciousness itself, per Alexander et al. This is a major complication for research. Remember what they were saying about we need theoretical research allowing for and describing plausible mechanisms. We're seeing the car drive, and we pop the bonnet, and there's no engine. What's going on with this thing? What sort of thing would you propose? Well, someone already did. And what happened to him? He got excommunicated. He was called a heretic. Dr. Alexander, when he related his experiences to colleagues, the responses he got were quite telling. The looks of polite disbelief, especially amongst my medical friends, who'd maybe realized what a task I would have getting people to understand the enormity of what I had seen and experienced that week while my brain was down. And he speculated that it's had something to do with the scientific structure that was worked so hard to build this thing. The castle of an old scientific theory begins to show fault lines. No one wants to pay attention at first. The old castle simply took too much work to build in the first place. We worked hard on this thing. If it falls, an entirely new one will have to be constructed in its place. There's a suggestion that something needs to change with the scientific castle. This issue has been grappled with extensively by philosophers. This is a philosophical issue. And reminded me of this fellow, Thomas Nagel, who wrote a book called The Mind and Cosmos quite a while back. He argued that consciousness, cognition, value cannot be adequately accounted for by reductionistic materialism, typically what we think of as science. If human beings are nothing but complex gene replicators, there's no reason to think that we possess any capacity to get outside of ourselves, understand the world beyond what is immediately required just for surviving. This is hitting at a root philosophical problem that I've been showing you. A resistance to accepting empirical evidence for something because it's challenging the structure, the philosophical issues. Science neither denies nor opposes the supernatural, but ignores it for methodological reasons. Well, there's the car, it's driving, we pop the bonnet. There's no engine. What do? What's the method for dealing with this? Of course, methodological naturalism does not restrict our study of nature. It just lays down which sort of study qualifies as scientific. Science is all about data. There's a phenomenon. Now explain it. Intelligent design and explanation for the existence of biology and us doesn't count as science because it violates a centuries-old grounds rules for science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation. You broke the rules. You're a heretic. You're cast out. This is reminiscent of something rather different, more historical. Has anyone heard of this theory, Deutero-Isaiah? So Deutero-Isaiah is a theory that two or more authors made the book of Isaiah. And they claim it was due to changes in tone and style, while also sidestepping, there's a very thorny issue in the book of Isaiah. He predicted Cyrus by name centuries before he existed. So how do you deal with that? Well, if you go to Wikipedia, which I do not recommend in general, Wikipedia is very biased, but it can be entertaining. If you go to the editors page, go to the background and the discussions between editors, it can be quite revealing. And the discussion with these editors, we see two of them disagreeing over this presentation of Deutero-Isaiah and the prophetic predictions of Cyrus. One claimed it's preposterous for historians to claim that a 10th century manuscript describes troop movements from Operation Barbarossa and gives the names of all the generals involved in the conflict. That's from World War II. Historians would default to forgery for that manuscript by the very requirements of the historical method. It's ludicrous to state this as empirical science. Really? That's one data point. He predicted the existence of a man by name centuries in advance. Is there any other data points? And that was the response. But why? Why should the accurate mention of future events in Cyrus's name automatically mean that Isaiah did not write those parts? If Isaiah was indeed a real prophet, why should such accuracy rule out his authorship? Are there any inconsistencies in the book of Isaiah text that would preclude single authorship? Or is there other evidence? It doesn't seem to matter to this editor. I'm sorry, this is how science works. If you want to edit Wikipedia, you should have high respect for science, right? So an accurate prophecy is disallowed as evidence because science. You're doing it wrong. It's science. Go away. And these critics claiming change in tone as evidence. That one I find amusing. So has anyone followed the careers of an author or a musician or a painter? are they exactly the same throughout their career? No, they change, right? Artists change, writers change. So to claim that and say, well, it was a different guy altogether because he changed some of his structure or whatever, or his painting technique was a bit different, it's the same person. They just evolve and change. The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga describes this issue at a philosophical level, this philosophical boundary, restricting what evidence is even considered as science. They accept that methodological naturalism, MN, is widely thought to characterize science. Well, what is it? It imposes a constraint on the evidence base of any scientific inquiry. The evidence base will include mathematics, logic, relevant current science, but the scientific evidence base is importantly different from a Christian one. And indeed, the scientific evidence base may include the denials of those beliefs. Conclusions are a simple consequence of the evidence base you start with. If you're chucking out a bunch of evidence because of the suggestions, oh, this might be evidence for paranormal, maybe there is telepathy, this might be evidence for sense of staring, this might be evidence that consciousness is independent of the brain, this might be evidence that a prophet could actually predict the name of a king centuries in advance. We just throw that away. Well, of course, the conclusions you're going to arrive at are going to be exactly the same. No, they're going to be different. You throw away data points and your fits are going to totally change. Right? That's why we see this incidence. Sheldrake's view can be condemned. It's heresy. If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you're schizophrenic. There's something wrong with you. It's ludicrous to state prophecy is empirical science. These looks of polite disbelief, especially amongst medical friends, made me realize what a task I would have. And remember what these researchers said. We emphasize it's important to free up this line of investigation from unwarranted skepticism and hasty judgments. These communication anomalies, sense of staring, telepathy, they should be treated and investigated in like manner with other psychological functions. And yet people that do this, they run into a philosophical boundary, and what happens to them? They get excommunicated, right? This is a philosophical issue. It isn't that there isn't evidence for something paranormal. It isn't that there isn't evidence for consciousness being independent of the brain. It's because it's challenging a materialistic reductionist worldview. Sense of staring, there's a modest and real statistical effect. Telepathy, same thing. Auditory verbal manifestations, the presumption that that means you're psychotic or morbid is false. These near-death experiences, they're completely independent of so many demographics that you would think would be there. Are you Catholic? Are you Buddhist? And they should be different. No, they're the same. Historical evidence, like for prophecy and the resurrection. The data awaits an explanatory theoretical framework to explain why when you see the car moving and you pop the bonnet and there's no engine, right? We need to figure out what's going on, but it's going to have to be beyond the confines of methodological naturalism. In other words, heresy, right? So if you're doing research and you want to look into this stuff, it's a minefield, right? I've actually cooked up several ideas on how to test sense of staring. I haven't gotten any money for it. Yeah, good luck with that, right? So what's the point of all this? Why have I brought you here today? So I can show you Simpsons movies. If the resurrection is not true, what does that mean about our faith? As Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless. Our faith is useless. The entire Christian faith rests upon one singular event in history. What is it? The resurrection. A demonstration of God's sovereignty over life and death. Is there evidence for it? Oh, yeah. Maybe not on YouTube. Someone wasn't filming the tomb. Oh, look, they rolled away the stone. It's empty. Oh, crud, what do we do? Right? But there is evidence. So much so that I would say that's another talk. You guys want to get a coffee? We'll get into the next hour, right? But denying the evidence for the resurrection is no different than denying the evidence for the stuff I've shown you. It bumps into a philosophical boundary. Philosophers have declared it's impossible. There cannot be a resurrection. There are people who adhere to this philosophical worldview that deny it and cook up these insane theories. It was mass psychosis. It was mass hallucination. It was a fabrication. All the apostles, they lied and died to hold up a fabrication. How many liars do you know and conspirators die for their conspiracy? The evidence for the resurrection is quite strong. And it's the same thing. It's the same issue. But interestingly, we see evidence. There's something beyond just this material world. And if we look back in time, there's a gigantic episode that demonstrated that convincingly, the resurrection. So that's pretty much what I had to say. But also at the end of my talks, because I am New Mexican, I want to torture you. So this is proper Mexican food from where I'm from, New Mexico. And I just have to say, why is the Mexican food here so bad? Right? It's hard to find good Mexican food. If anyone knows good Mexican food, and by the way, thanks, Barbara. I still remember your Mexican food. That was wonderful. Right? If anyone knows a good Mexican restaurant, let me know. But aside from all that, thank you for coming out this evening and listening to me blather on. For how long did we go? I lost track. But thanks for coming, everyone. And how are we doing for time? Where's Disney? Do we have time for maybe a few questions? Does anyone want to ask me stuff? Yes, I hear voices. Just not right now. Right. Any thoughts? Complaints? Yeah.
I have a little question.
Oh, wait, we had one up here first, Richard.
You can go to Amazon and search under books for near-death experiences.
Yeah.
And there may be 100 books on near-death experiences.
Okay.
And some of them are written by surgeons. And their patients have died on the operating table and they've been revived. Talking to them the following day, the surgeon hears their account of what they saw while their heart was stopped. And they report elevating and looking down and seeing their body on the operating table. They see people rushing around and doing things.
Yeah. And they go, that's my body. Holy moly. Yeah.
But the surgeons realized that what the guy saw is what they were actually doing, because they go into a fixed routine if a heart stops.
So they were describing with quite a bit of accuracy what they were actually doing in the theater.
Yeah.
It wasn't just random things that they were describing.
Yeah, right. And also they would sometimes see something written on the top of some piece of equipment.
All right.
And they'd report that. And the surgeon or somebody would go and check.
They're like, really? It says what? Yeah.
On there.
And then they go and they're, yeah, it's the manufacturer's label, blah, 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 blah. It's exactly.
Or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. I didn't really look at, I know there's quite a few books that are published on the topic, but so as a researcher, my knee-jerk response or knee-jerk approach is go to PubMed. So I go to PubMed is like an online database for research articles that have a biological or medical clinical bent. And so that's where I found a lot of these interesting articles.
Yeah.
It particularly is all these experiences of near-death experiences, they're quite consistent from all over the world.
And
Completely different people. What's that?
There are hundreds of
Yeah, there's so many of them. It's astonishing that there could be any. Right? How could this be? How could anyone experience something when their brain's not functioning or their heart is stopped?
Well, you mentioned something about the mind and the brain.
Yeah.
That they're separate.
Yeah.
Well, this would seem to me to be evidence that they are separate.
Yeah.
That the mind exists independently of the brain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what a lot of this evidence is pointing to. And as a researcher, I find that very annoying. Because how do you get how do you get a hold of that? How are you supposed to cook up a theory to what's the mechanism? How do you understand this? How are you going to nail down? And that's part of the problem. That's partly why Nagel came out with this book. We don't have a clue about consciousness. When it comes to those problems, we don't have a clue. I mean, it's a reductionist like to come down. Well, look at the brain. You can just see the brain. Everything's in the brain. There's all this evidence that says no. The car's driving and you pop the bonnet and there's no engine, right? There's something else going on and it's not clear. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, just thinking about these voices you can't record. Would you say they're saying things you can comprehend in past, or is it like...
I forgot to mention that I have been in circumstances where these declarations have come out and people around me have responded to them. So it's not just me. And it did astonish me how, like, particularly before I became Christian, some of my experiences with them is I complained to the voice, I can't understand you. Why don't you use a phone? And so I shared this with the group, right? How so long ago we had phones with cables coming out of them. Right? You guys didn't, I had to explain this, right? Like, what? You had a phone tied around you? Yeah. So I didn't, the phone wasn't by my bed back then. It was way on the other side of the room because I didn't want to answer it if someone called. And after I complained, well, why don't you use a phone so maybe I can understand what you're saying? The next day I woke up and I had the phone wrapped all around my body and stuck on my head. And I was freaked out. Yeah.
So when did you differentiate from going through drug rehab and stuff like that to the voices you're hearing there compared to becoming a Christian, obviously?
Oh, yeah. So I went through rehab in 1990, and I was clean for years. I didn't use my drug of choice. Well, I haven't. In fact, oh, wow. I've got 35 years. It'll be 35 years next year since I used my drug of choice. Yeah, praise God.
So when did you start, like, being able to tell people this and all that kind of stuff?
Actually, it was through sharing my testimony. Because, I mean, that's part of the reason why I became Christian, right? It was like, what the heck is going on? What are all these weird experiences? And so that's partly why I picked up this Bible. I thought maybe in the index, maybe there's something, if you wear garlic at night, they can't get you. Okay, maybe there's a formula, right? Maybe this Bible has a formula or something. And it was along the way that I started reading it. And I just threw it open. I could have thrown it open to Leviticus or something. And so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so. This is useless. These Jews were busy. What do I care? Right? I need a formula. Yeah, yeah. So that was it. Yeah, yeah. You have a question?
Have you come across somebody called Jerry Mazinski?
Jerry Mazinski.
He's a psychiatrist and studied schizophrenics and the voices because he became more interested in where these voices come from and the commonalities.
Oh.
I think he's done quite a big study, but it started off in a mental institution.
Okay.
Got a lot of resistance because he was interested in the voices. He wasn't just trying to medicate and shut them up.
Yeah, yeah. Here's your Thorazine, be quiet. No, he wanted to.
That became a big issue, but then he went and studied in prisons.
Yeah. So that's where he could get subjects.
They didn't really care too much about, if it seemed to torture the prisoners, because the voices became louder and more aggressive the more they were questioned and focused on.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of like this fellow that was saying, you confront them and they get more loud and aggressive. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was the thing in the prison.
So the prisoners couldn't escape. Right? We could tie you down.
So it's really
Wow.
it's interesting because he said that he started trying different things to see what would work with the voices, how they'd react.
Yeah.
And then the Bible seemed to have a massive reaction universally to these voices, and specifically Psalm 23. So that's how he treated and successfully helped them overcome schizophrenia.
Using the Bible.
Using Psalm 23.
Oh, I don't remember Psalm 23.
It's the Lord is my shepherd.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so it's a really interesting thing because he wasn't Christian.
And he bumped into this.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder where that led him. Like he was like, okay, what's up with this Bible thing? Maybe there's a formula in the back that says you wear garlic and they stop talking to you. Mazinski, is it?
Yeah, Jerry
Mazinski. I haven't bumped into his stuff. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't typically look at psychiatric things. Maybe I'll have some interest, like I did for researching for this or looking into it personally. My field is math bio, so if I hear voices, it's usually a PhD student asking me a question.
I think it's also fairly recent. It's only the last few years.
Oh, okay. Oh, wonderful. Oh, okay. Okay. I'll probably dig up his stuff through PubMed and see where I go. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Shawn, back to Kim's question.
Oh, yeah.
Was the difference between the voices you hear now, who are they from?
Got me. Yeah.
And the voices you heard before you became a Christian?
I think it's the same lot, but I'm not really sure. I will say that some of my experiences were quite intense before I became a Christian. And from the way that I've interpreted it is that I'm very resistant to doing what God wants. And I think this was how God got me to read my Bible. It's like, you got this thing sitting on the shelf. Maybe you should check it out. Nah. And it was with flaming whips that he got me to read that thing. And I remember I was going to read it. Okay, decide, okay, finally, I'm going to look at this goofy Bible thing. And you know what stopped me from looking at it? I don't want to be like Ned Flanders. Because I believe the caricature of Christianity, like that's what a Christian is. No, I don't want to be that. So I ran in circles for a bit. Read the Bible! No, I don't want to read the Bible! Read the Bible! And that was mostly because a lot of what I was hearing had a very Christian sort of atmosphere to it. Like it just seemed Christian-y in some way. I don't know. It just suggested maybe there's something in this Bible thing, right? And so I did. So I read the thing. Yeah. As to how they were before I was Christian and after, before there was a certain degree of intensity, and after it got more intense. Especially also the visions and the physical sensations. It became clear to me and to these things that God used them to bring me to Christianity. And they didn't like that.
Obviously, when you become a Christian, same thing attacks more. So
Yeah.
is that why it felt more intense?
Oh, what's that? Sorry.
Is that why it felt more intense?
I presume so, yeah. Yeah, there was a degree of irritation. Oh, crud, he became a Christian. Whoops. But it was clear to me that, oh, God used these folks, right, to bring me to a point where, like, what's going on? So I read this Bible thing, yeah. So it also was a profound demonstration in my mind that God is indeed sovereign, that he can use anyone and anything for his purposes, even the enemy. And when you go back and you look in time, you're like, well, look at the crucifixion. This was a profound demonstration. They wanted to kill Jesus. But that was the plan. Huh? Yeah. When the apostles were looking up at Christ, they thought, this is a disaster. They had no idea. No, this is completion. This is the way out. This is the sacrifice. This is their defeat. And their moment of triumph, they discovered their defeat. I mean, if they were upset with me, how were they back then? Just livid, right? And so went out on a policy of some blind people so they can't see this shining glory. I give you your life back. Anything else?
Relationship between drug use and those sorts of spiritual experiences?
Oh, geez. I have taken hallucinogens, and I had some pretty spiritual experiences on hallucinogens, yeah. But when I was having these experiences, I was not taking hallucinogens. And in fact, I got into this with some of my scientific colleagues. Oh, you just had some drug-induced schizophrenia or drug-induced delusions, hallucinations. Ironically, I would say because I've taken hallucinogens, I know what it's like to hallucinate on a drug. And it's nothing like the stuff I experience, where I would see a being and interact with it. I never took enough hallucinogens for that to happen, right? So usually when you're on mushrooms or whatever hallucinogen, it's more on the periphery, where things are a little bit tweaked and weird. Don't look in mirrors. Yeah, just a handy tip. Right? It's like the kinds of hallucinations that you have are just utterly different than the experiences I had. And so that's my counterpoint. It's like, I don't think this was drug-induced because I'd never experienced anything like this stuff. Also, and I mentioned this in my testimony, partly what happened is all these things unfolded around the time that I had befriended some witches that were practicing witches, and they didn't hide that fact. And I didn't really think too much about it because I was a pantheist at the time. So everything is good. Good and evil are all part of the same thing. So when they asked me to watch their place for them while they went home for Christmas, I'll never forget I was chasing the cat in the back room. I was thinking, cat, come back over here. And so I go into this back room and I saw the creepiest things, along with a library of demonology, spells, charms. They were practicing witches. And it wasn't until there was a mistake one of them made, and I recognized them in the middle of this sequence of events and visions. And I'm like, oh, wow, so-and-so, they're a witch. It started making sense. And that's partly what kind of led me to, how do I counter this? How do I deal with this? Because I was being pushed to madness. I was being pushed off a cliff, either to shoot up again or to jump off a cliff and commit suicide, or just end up in an institution. So actually reaching for Christianity, reaching for the Bible was an act of self-defense. It literally was, right? I mean, it may have been, there's no formula for garlic, but along the way, the Lord used it, right? Because he's in charge of all this stuff. He knows what he's doing. And so I would say that without the Holy Spirit, there is real power in the Holy Spirit. We know this, right? I never forget, this wasn't my personal experience, but so at the Calvary Chapel in Albuquerque, some of you know of Skip Heitzig? So I would go see him a lot on Wednesday nights. I'd go there in Albuquerque and just sit in my butt and not do anything and just listen. Oh, Skip Heitzig's talking. And one time he was talking about how one of the saved witches, a witch that was practicing, became a Christian, told Skip how one of the things they had to be careful about is if they used a spell or a charm or attacked a Christian, they had to be careful because sometimes the Holy Spirit would flip them back, which is hilarious, right? Because that's what you deserve, right? So it was just reflected back on them. There was this recognition that there is power in Christianity. The Holy Spirit protects us. But it doesn't mean that we're completely insulated from everything, right? He protects us as we walk through this world and we get attacked, we get waylaid. Kind of like how one of the attacks that I deal with now, like with my math talk, I am constantly hit with sleep deprivation. So now what typically happens to me is in the middle of the night, I get shaken and woken up. And I'm ticklish, so I get tickled. It's perverse, but I get tickled and it wakes me up. And then I feel injections into my body and my heart goes nuts. I'm awake, so I do stuff. But that also means I'm sleep deprived. And I've noticed most people can't really tell. Oh, it's just Shawn. Right? But I'm sleep deprived. This has been going on for years, but it's gotten a little more intense over the last couple of years. Like particularly before I preach or I speak or I do an apologetics talk, or if I have a work thing where I have to present for work and there's all these big shots and I have to impress them, I'm always getting hit. I think one of the most intense ones is when I went to Shanghai for a conference. I don't speak Mandarin, nor do I read it. And running on 3 hours of sleep. Whoa, this is fun. But you know what? God takes care of us. I'm still able to function. I'm still able to do my work. I'm still able to give presentations. I'm still able to speak. And then when I get a chance to, it's like, okay, you can rest now. Okay, sweet. I collapse. Right? He gives us strength to deal with these things. There's power in Christianity. And that's what originally drew me to it. How do I defend myself against these attacks? What do I do? I certainly don't want to be one. Instead, I'm here as a Christian talking to you tonight.
So did you get a lot of ministry for this, or did you just...
Get a lot of ministry? How do you mean?
Ministry to figure out how to handle all this stuff, or you just figure it out?
I just pray a lot. Cling to God's big toe, right? As you should as a Christian. Or, hold on to God. Whether it's his toe, I don't know. But I haven't really, I've had friends tell me, well, you can get, have these things cast out. You can get ministered to in some sense. But I've never really felt led to do that. Being a Christian means you're going to get hit with stuff. Yeah. It's a math question, finally. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Do you have a question? No. Earlier you were talking about being having demons cast out, or said if that's real or not, or were you just talking about when it's cinematized, or what did you mean by that?
Oh, you mean like the William Friedkin thing? Yeah, so I only just gave a hint of that because I was like, I don't want to get into this. I was more interested in the responses. Like, what the heck is going on? How a scientist would look at this. And so that's why I just told you about, this is what psychiatrists had to say. This is what a neurophysiologist had to say. If you watch the William Friedkin documentary, it gets pretty weird. I mean, I don't know how I feel about the Catholic thing. I'm uncomfortable with the Catholic Church because they have some stuff that I'm like, no thanks. Also, New Mexico is profoundly Catholic. It's by far predominantly Catholic. And there's some of the things that they get into that I think is just plain creepy. Thank you very much. But, so if you watch the documentary, you can see this Catholic thing going on. But I think one of the most disturbing elements to it is when he was filming this, and he had recordings of it, he was approached by the family of the woman that was exorcised, and they threatened him, give us the video or we're going to kill you. We'll come after your family. And he described how he never felt more in danger at that moment, and he had to get the heck out. And somehow he escaped that situation. There were people that never wanted this to never see the light of day, that never wanted this to get out there and anyone to see it. So there's definitely something to that, but I'm not really interested in that bit. Actually, I think the exorcism failed, if I remember, for this particular woman, that she's been dealing with these things for decades. But for me, I'm more interested in the scientific side. Like, what do scientists think of this? What's the mechanism? What does it mean? And again, I just use it to point, there's something beyond just the brain, just a materialistic reductionist worldview. Yeah, so sorry, you'll have to watch the doco. So if you like, just look at William Friedkin and you'll see all kinds of crazy stuff. Yeah. Oh yeah, I like the Exorcist movies, right? Anything else come to mind? Yeah.
Is this like if this is outside of your normal field, is this like a long-term side hobby of study due to your
Yeah. Well, research, you often dabble in other stuff. But also, being a mathematical biologist, I've looked at so many different biological systems. So often, when you do research, you want to do what's called cross-pollination. So you want to see how different fields operate. How did you solve this problem? How did you approach this? Oh, they did it this way. Like ecologists, the way they deal with their data, it's crazy, right? But they have techniques. So, I can use this technique. I can apply it to my problem. So you often dabble in different fields, right? But particularly personally, I was just like, okay, so I'm hearing these things. Does that mean I'm crazy? Right? So what does this mean? And so seeing some of this stuff come out, I was like, no, you're not crazy. Yeah, there's a lot of people. And like I said, that's just one data point. If you're going to diagnose someone, you need multiple data points before you go, you have this, right? Same thing, right? Or an automobile. It doesn't start. Oh man, the starter must be shot. The engine's broken, blah, 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 blah. There's no drive belts. There's no wheels. No, you just need to put gas in it. Right? Anything else? Okay. It's 8:30 and I can see I'm losing some of the audience. He just keeps talking. Well, if you want, we can start talking about math. It is bedtime.
Does your research ever lead you down the path to consider just how improbable the start of life would be?
Oh, geez. Oh, no worries. I think I talked about that. I spoke at King's College a while back, and I talked about the value of life. And you know how rare life is? We're incredibly, incredibly rare. And so it's, we have value, but not because we have economic potential, but because God says we are valuable. We are precious in God's sight. And so from a scientific perspective, I've read Richard Dawkins' stuff, and he is a smoke and mirrors con artist. Like in his book, The God Delusion, he said, what if the odds of life happening are really improbable, 1 billion to 1? And he goes, well, wait a minute. There's billions upon billions of stars and billions upon billions of planets. It must be like Star Wars with all the critters with the antenna and playing the clarinets and bizarre little cantinas, because it must have happened billions upon billions of times. But when you go back and you look at his first premise, the odds of life just happening is 1 billion to 1. That's very generous. Other researchers have looked at this. Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, he looked at this decades ago. And in his book on origins of life, He actually calculated what are the odds of a very simple, let's say the simplest protein to just accidentally happen in life. The odds are something like 10 to the 250 power to 1 against. Who's going to bet those odds? 10 to the 250. Like, these numbers are so vast. I think it's something like it's been 10 to the 20 seconds since Jesus walked the earth. That was like last weekend, yeah? 10 to the 20 seconds. 10 to the 20, that's a huge number. That's not even close to 10 to the 250. There's also the number of atoms in the universe are 10 to the 80. He computed it 10 to the 250 to 1 against. We are insanely rare. It is insanely improbable that we just happened. Yeah, I've looked at it. yeah.
And yet people follow those odds, and they give up, and they say, well, I'm far more likely that I'll go to heaven.
How do you mean?
Well, what I'm saying is they will bet on those odds.
Oh.
And say that I can get to heaven.
Regardless, yeah.
Regardless.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard those arguments about God doesn't send anyone to hell, that he loves everyone. Well, of course he loves everyone, but we have choices to make.
Yeah.
There are conditions in the Bible. If, then. It's not you will regardless.
I bet their eternity on it.
Yeah, betting your eternity. This is like a casino, right?
Yeah.
And when you go get your chips, you put your soul in and you get a few chips out. Yay, let's go play. You fritter your eternity away. And it's amazing how people do that. And I think that's because people are deceived. If you can erect an effective wall of propaganda around people, they'll make very dumb choices because it's based on the information they have. Right? And that's how the enemy works, is to deceive all of us.
What's the documentary that you're talking about?
The William Friedkin one.
Oh, you said about a documentary?
Yeah, I was saying, so that's about the exorcism. It's a bit disturbing if you want to watch it, yeah. Right, that's probably right. I only gave a hint of it. I didn't want to show the thing because it's pretty disturbing. Yeah. But so in the Catholic Church, there are exorcists. That's their job as a priest. They go out and they exorcise things. Yeah. What a job that must be. Right. Yeah. Anything else, folks? I think there's still tea and cakes and stuff. Yeah. So please take some cake. And thanks again for everyone coming.